So I grew up in Kentucky. How many of you are from Kentucky and how many are from out of state? Anybody here from out of state? So about half and half. So I grew up in a little town in Kentucky. 1,500 people live there. And I took things apart. I wanted to know how things work. I guess I'm an engineer at heart, but I didn't have any money to buy parts. And this is before all those robot contests they have now. So if you wanted to build a robot, you had to find the parts yourself. So I took apart any piece of junk I could find that had things in it that I could use to build things. This while I was in high school. And I entered science fairs. And it was my dream to go to MIT. I'd never even visited the campus, but I read about it and it sounded like a good school. So I applied and got accepted, but I never did visit the campus. I just showed up. Can you imagine coming to Bellarmine without ever visiting the campus? Like, you get here like 3 days before class. That was my experience at MIT. Going from a town of 1,500 people in Kentucky, where I lived all my life, to Boston, Massachusetts. So the first crosswalk I went through in Boston, a car honked. And I did what we did growing up in Vanceburg. I turned around and waved at it. Of course, the driver was waving back, but they only had one finger up. They didn't want to yield to me. Anyways, I had a little bit of culture shock going from Kentucky to Boston. But I was there to learn and to build things, and so I got a sort of like an internship in the robotics lab. And while I was there, I worked there 4 years for the same professor. I developed this virtual reality interface. Now this was in 1993, and it was good. It was my thesis project. You have to do an undergraduate thesis at MIT. So I invented a device that you put your finger in, and it feels like you're touching three-dimensional objects. It has motors and encoders in it, and it's connected to a linkage. You see the three-dimensional shape on the computer screen, but as you move your finger forward, in my device, if there was a hard object there, it would stop you immediately, and you couldn't go into that object. But we could program the object to be soft. We could program it to deform when you pushed on it. And so I changed the thimble out for a stylus, and we started doing like medical simulation with this invention. So what it would be like to puncture skin, maybe do an epidural, you could feel the forces as you were going in to the virtual patient, if you will. So that was my invention. I was an undergraduate student, and I'd never started a company. The dean, right, was kind enough to say that I stayed at MIT to get another degree. The reason I stayed there is my wife also grew up in Kentucky, also went to MIT. She's 2 years younger than me. And so she was finishing her undergraduate, and I was pretty much stuck at MIT for another 2 years, so that's why I got a master's degree. But so I finished my senior thesis and spent the summer. What happened was at MIT in this laboratory where I had developed this device, there was no software for it yet, just the software I had written. People would come into the laboratory. Like the Wall Street Journal reporter came into our laboratory and saw this thing, and none of these had ever existed before. It was the first of its kind in the world. So he wrote an article about it in the Wall Street Journal. And then there would be people from the Navy. I think there were even a couple congressmen, but I never paid attention to them, that came into the laboratory, and I would show the device. And I had people say, "Do you know how to build another one of these?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I could build another one." And I had no software for it. These were all people that were going to write their own applications for it. And so what happened was the head of the Navy laboratory came in, and the Air Force and the Army. So what I did is I agreed to sell these devices to people. I hadn't figured out the patents yet. It was patent pending. The university helped me apply for the patent. And then I had to license it back from the university. And we can talk about technology licensing if you want, but I worked that out. But so I got orders for this thingamajig. All right, it was an invention. Nobody knew what it would be useful for yet. We suspected it would be good for medical simulation, which ultimately turned out not to be the major application for it. And so I got these orders, and I had to figure out how to price the device. So most of you are in business or finance. Like how would you price something? If somebody said, if you invented something and they said, I want to buy that, how would you price it? Well, you're certainly not going to sell it for less than what it costs you to make, right? So I had read in books that if you buy something in the store, that really the production cost is only about 1/4 of what you're paying for it. That some of it goes to the overhead of the company, some of it goes into marketing. You're going to have to pay taxes, you're going to fund more research and development. So I just arbitrarily, I said, okay, this cost me about $2,500 to make one of these because it had some really fancy motors and some computer chips in it. So I said, I'll sell them for, well, it costs about maybe $2,500, $3,000. I'll sell it for $12,000. And so I sold like 5 of them for $12,000. Or I took the orders. I hadn't built them yet. Now, to get the capital to buy the parts, because people wouldn't pay me in advance, I was selling these primarily, the first ones, to other government laboratories and other universities that wanted it in their shops. So what I did is, this is the other reason I got a master's degree. I had a fellowship which included a stipend, and it would pay for housing. But they gave me they paid my tuition to go to grad school, but they also gave me a stipend and to cover living expenses. Well, they gave it all to me in August, and I had to disperse it responsibly over the course of the year, and I spent it all in September, like on parts. And then I had a credit card that I put some stuff on. I don't really advise that. I inherited $3,000 when my grandmother died. Well, my brother and sister were younger than me, and they also inherited $3,000, and my mother directed them to loan it to me. So there was $12,000. So I came up with enough money to buy the parts for the first ones of these. Now, who did the manufacturing? Well, I manufactured the first one, and so my wife and I manufactured the first 4 or 5 of these. Where did we make them? We snuck into MIT's machine shop and produced them there. Now, because I had a key to it, you could go there like at midnight or 1 in the morning or whatever, as long as you didn't get your arm torn off in the lathe, they were okay with that. But at MIT, there's all sorts of companies being started there. In fact, they have what's called now it's like the 50K business plan contest. When I was there, it was the 10K business plan contest, where the best business plan gets $10,000. 2 years after I started my company, I actually won the 10K business plan contest. I submitted a business plan before we had raised any capital. So anyways, my wife and I, we had to punt a few problem sets. Do you still call it punting? Or when you don't do your homework? Anyways, we punted a few problem sets. We spent some late nights in the machine shop. We built these devices, and we sold them for $12,000. And it was a lot more work than I thought. And the reason I didn't send them to a machine shop and have somebody else make them is I didn't have the drawings done yet. So my wife sat down on a CAD system and did all the drawings so we could send them out to the machine shop. Well, a funny thing happened after I sold like the first 4 or 5 or 6 of these for $12,000 a piece. I realized that the demand curve, like I kind of got a feeling for what the demand curve for these devices was. Every one of my customers that bought this $12,000 device from me ran it with a $100,000 computer. Like there was a computer company called Silicon Graphics, and they made like $100,000 computers that could do 3D graphics. And I was like, well, I know they've got at least $100,000 to spend because they bought a computer. And then that cost that much. And I also noticed that a lot of these people had to get purchase orders because anything over $10,000 required a purchase order, but they could do it with one signature as long as it was under $20,000 or something. So what did I do? Like, I just woke up one day and raised the price to $19,995. It doesn't really matter what it costs you to make it if you don't have any competition, right? That should not enter into your equation. You can figure out what it costs you to stay in business, but that's not the profit maximizing choice. You need to look at sort of what the demand curve is and who your customers are. Which, by the way, is why nobody pays the same price for a plane ticket. When you get on a plane and there's like 100 passengers, the odds that 2 people paid the exact same price on there are pretty low. And it's also the reason there's a first class section, right? Because if you're willing to spend, some people are willing to spend $20,000 for a plane ticket. Why would you want to sell it to them for $99 to go to Tampa, right? If somebody is willing to spend $20,000 for a plane ticket, you should get at least $2,000 from them for that plane ticket. Don't sell it to them for $99. So that's price differentiation. And has anybody in here had microeconomics, class in micro? Okay. Has anybody had macroeconomics? All right. For the people that raise their hand both times, do you like macro or micro better? There's like 3 of you. 4.
I'm only taking macro.
Micro. I took micro and macro. I think macro is more applicable to a politician, and micro is more applicable to business. I did not like macro. Of course, at the time, I didn't like politicians. I like them even less now that I work with them. But my macro teacher was Paul Krugman, who is not a friend of conservatives. But in the macro class, I didn't like it as much as micro. Micro is what explains why the plane tickets are different prices when you get on there. Micro explains why they print coupons and put them in the newspaper, right? Because if you're willing to cut out a coupon out of the newspaper and take it to the grocery store, then you're probably not willing to pay as much for, a gallon of milk as the person whose time is too valuable to sit there and cut the coupon out. So it's a way to price differentiate. So I had taken micro, and so I needed to figure out a way to price differentiate. The problem is I have one device and one price, right? So I knew I was selling this thing to people who would pay $100,000. And I was selling it to them for the low price of $19,995. So I had a customer come to me, and then some people were only willing to pay $10,000, right? So I never got to sell them one. There was no way to make the price that low. If I'd been smart, I probably would have figured out a way to sell one to them too. But I had a customer come to me, and they said, could you make these changes? Could you make it bigger? We need the workspace to be bigger. We need to measure the orientation of the stylus, not just the location. So I had some requirements, and I thought, well, to engineer that and to produce the drawings and to do all that extra work cost me $5,000 for the first one. Then the incremental cost is about $500, like for the next one. So I said, okay, instead of $20,000, I'm going to sell this for $25,000 to this customer. It was the media lab at MIT, by the way. I knew they had gobs of money. They had just built this brand new building. So I said, all right, $25,000, I'll sell you a customized device. And they didn't blink. They didn't bat an eye. They said, all right, we'll take it. So I made a little extra money on that, but then what I realized is there were the people that were willing to pay more for a device. That's how I could test and find out. I had 2 versions now. I had the one that was $19,995, and I had the one that was $24,995. So what I found out is the people that had a lot of money and were willing to buy the more expensive one, they always bought the $25,000 one, which, by the way, only cost me $500 more to make. But it was a way for that customer to tell me, I've got more money than you're charging me. So I'll take the most expensive version. In fact, I sold 2 of these to General Electric. So it would have been $50,000. But it was hard at General Electric at the time to get a purchase order for a PC, a computer, because when corporations try to crack down, like tighten the belt, they make you go through purchasing, and purchasing has already negotiated a price with Dell for instance, on all their computers. And so GE agrees to only buy Dell, and you got to go through the purchasing agent at GE if you want a new computer. And they ask, how old's your computer? Oh, it's only 3 years old. We're not getting you a new computer. But these people wanted a new computer. So my device was called the Phantom. So what I added to the price list, I noticed a lot of customers had this problem. A Pentium-based Phantom controller, which was basically I would go to Gateway and buy them a computer and put my card in it that controlled my device and sell them a $2,000 Gateway computer for $5,000. But their demand curve, like when you start learning things about the customer, it was worth $5,000 to them. They had no way to buy a computer that would work with my device. Because as soon as they told their purchasing agent, I'm buying a PC, it became a living hell to get that computer through. So anyways, I figured, so one day, so I buy these computers, I make the devices, and I ship them to GE, but before I ship them, they call me up. The purchasing agent is unleashed on me. They have professional price negotiators at big companies, right? And she said, I'm under a lot of pressure here to get 10% off on this thing. We can't buy this unless you give me a 10% discount. And I knew the purchasing agent had no clue what she was actually trying to negotiate on. I said, okay, we'll take off the encoder gimbal. That'll save the price for you. What? No, we got to have the encoder gimbal. She had no idea what an encoder gimbal was. I knew she didn't, so I offered her all these ways that she could get the price she wanted, and she was not able to do that. So she said, well, we need net 90 on this. So you all know what net 30 is in business terms? If you don't know what net 30 is, you're going to find out what net 30 is when you go into work for somebody. Typical business practice is when you order something, you pay for it within 30 days of receiving it. When one business sells something to another business. It doesn't work that way on the internet, right? They want your credit card or your PayPal account, and you pay for it right now. But when a business buys something from another business, a lot of times it's net 30. So this purchasing agent said she wanted net 90. I thought, net 90, that'll kill me. Like, I'm in hock up to my eyeballs. I've got to pay for the housing. Like, my wife and I are staying in married student housing. I've already spent the stipend. And if they do net 90, I'll never get the stipend back in time to make the housing payment. So I said, no, I'm not doing net 90. And so then she said, well, how about, let's see, 2 net 10. Does anybody know what that is, or 10 net 2? I had no clue what it was, but I was in the habit of saying no with this lady. So I said, no way. What she meant, I would have taken it in a heartbeat if I'd actually known what she was trying to negotiate. What she meant was she would pay me within 10 days if I would give her a 2% discount. Like that's for paying your bill early. It's called like 10 net 2 or 2 net 10 or something. It's like the purchasing lingo. I had no idea what it was. But I was like, that's absurd. That's preposterous. I'm not taking 10 net 2. So I sent him the device. And 120 days later, I'm calling GE. I'm like, where the hell is my money? I had, that's the other thing purchasing agents do. If they have the power, they don't pay you. Like, what are you going to do? Turn General Electric into Dun & Bradstreet and ruin their credit? Like, put them on the Better Business Bureau? Like, I sold $70,000 of lab equipment to General Electric and they wouldn't pay on time. Like, nobody cares. They're the gorilla and you're the banana, right? So I finally got paid 6 months later or something. But that was sort of a lesson in being the banana and dealing with the gorilla and selling to General Electric. So the purchasing agent got me back in the end anyways. So anyways, that's sort of a little bit of how things went in the beginning. So for 2 years I was bootstrapping the company, and my wife and I started out as an S Corp. Have you all gone over the various forms of corporations and companies? Like you can be an S Corp. What's the other type of corporation? C Corp. That's right. So if you don't want to be a corporation, what can you be?
So proprietorship,
So-
partnership, LLC.
Those were the three I was thinking about. And if there's another one, I don't know it. But those are basically the five: C corp, S corp, LLC, sole proprietor, or partnership. various forms of different thing and give you different liability protection. I went to the bookstore and I bought a book called Ink Yourself, because at first I didn't want to pay a lawyer to incorporate my company. Like, I wanted to figure out what all these terms meant. And so I read the book Ink Yourself, and I decided like S corp was the best thing for me. But then I ultimately hired a lawyer to do the paperwork and do the filing with the Secretary of State and whatnot. So that's how I started my company. Now with an S corp, I'm going to test you since you know so much about this. How do you calculate the taxes on an S corp and who pays them?
Taxes on that.
What's that? Oh, taxes.
Taxes on that.
So this is one of the big differences between a C corp. A C corp, by the way, is General Electric and literally anybody on the stock exchange. Most corporations are a C corp. An S corp is, and C corps pay taxes on their earnings, and then when they pay a dividend to their shareholders, the shareholders pay a tax on the dividend. So a C corp, you're really paying a tax twice to get if you're an investor in a C corp. An S corp, it's the shareholders that pay the taxes whenever the company makes money. So why am I telling you this? Because I was an S corp, and after being in business for a year, I was still a grad student, my wife's still an undergrad, we had sold $220,000 of phantoms of these devices. $220,000. And we're still students, like wearing the same sneakers we came in freshman year. We had, in our married student housing, we had a cardboard box for a dining room table, and we had sold $200,000 of product, and every dollar that was coming in, we weren't really paying ourselves a salary. We had stipend, right? And we were just reinvesting it in the company, buying more parts and things like that. And we had people like GE who were stringing us out for long periods of time. So I took all my receipts, put them in a shoebox, taped it all up, sent it to an accountant in Kentucky. I'm living in Massachusetts. I didn't know any accountants up there. I sent it to my dad's accountant in Kentucky. And he said, well, he called me up a few weeks later. He said, I got good news and bad news. I said, well, what's the good news? He said, the good news is you made $110,000 of profit. And I'm thinking, I don't have $110,000. Where did all that go? And because we had reinvested it in parts, right? And we still had people that owed us money. $110,000 of profit, and he said, which means you owe $40,000 in taxes. Like, I don't know if any of you, like, you're still in college, like, what if you found out you owed $40,000 in taxes? And you had finals in 4 weeks, right? And it was graded on the curve, right? And everybody around you is like going to ace this test. So anyways, that's called stress. And he also said, and by the way, you are at the level now, you need to make quarterly estimated payments. And so you owe $15,000 in quarterly estimated payments. So you owe, literally, you got to come up with $55,000 here pretty quick. That's basically when I became a Republican. I do think that we do need, whether you're Republican or Democrat, we do need a better model that doesn't punish small companies. Because like the tax code is there for the big guys, right? They're the ones, now I can see the whole loop coming around. The big guys are the ones making the donations to candidates and get them on the Ways and Means Committee, which is the tax committee, which, by the way, I'll never be on the Ways and Means Committee because I don't raise enough money and give it to the party. Like, you literally have to buy your seat when you get to Congress. It's ridiculous. They should go to jail for this, but they don't. But getting back to this, the big guys pay for lobbyists who basically have remote controls on the congressmen that are on the Ways and Means Committee that writes the tax code. And there's 70,000 pages of tax code. Why does there need to be 70,000 pages of tax code? It mainly benefits the big guys, and I would like to see us do something that is like more fair to people that try to bootstrap, like with cash, right? I didn't have any venture capitalists investing in my company. I had no investors at the time. I was trying to bootstrap it, and what I found out was that when they make you pay taxes on money that you've already reinvested into the company, it's hard to bootstrap. When you've got 30 to 40% of all the money you're trying to reinvest in the company is being taken out as you're growing, it's rough. So that was like one of the life lessons that stuck with me, was making that tax payment. Now my wife and I punted some more problem sets, and we found out what 10 net 2 means or whatever, and we started calling people up and offering them a discount if they would pay early. And we had a few orders that, frankly, we were dragging our feet on that we could get out the door. And so we got those little loose ends finished and shipped products, and we made our tax payment, and then had to start making quarterly tax payments. So that's, I'm going to go a little bit quicker now through the rest of the company, but I thought you might be, since most of you haven't started a company yet, you probably need to know about the beginning part the most. And then when you get to raising venture capital, come and see me, and I'll give you the long form of that speech. But so what happened is I did this for 2 years, and I think the second year we made like $400,000. We were still college students, and we didn't make $400,000, but we had $400,000 in business, and we made more profit, and we put it back into the company. But it was getting hard to grow the company. We had more orders than we could actually fulfill, because the government was coming in and taking 30 to 40%. So we were growing faster than the tax rate on S-corps would really allow. And we needed somebody to invest in our company. And I had people that wanted to invest in our company, but I just always sort of got the heebie-jeebies around them. I thought they were trying to steal my company, and some of them legitimately were. But it was hard for me to know what was reasonable and what wasn't reasonable. In fact, I might have been walking away from good deals because I just didn't get a good feeling, or I didn't understand the lingo. Like when the GE purchasing agent offered to pay me early if I'd give her a discount. I would have taken that. I just didn't know what it was. So I was an engineer. I wasn't a business major. And I was in an incubator space. There were about 5 companies that we shared this one conference room. We were just 2 blocks from the MIT campus. The directions to get to our office was, start at MIT, turn left at the gay bar, right at the nuclear factory, and left at the candy factory. And people were like, what? Yeah. That was how you got to our, anybody ever had Necco wafers? It's a horrible candy. I see the old people saying yes, or older people. That'll lose you some votes real quick. Don't say that at an AARP meeting. Anyways, they made candy wafers right next to us. We were in incubator space, and one of these other companies in the incubator space seemed to have their stuff together, and the guy that worked the hardest was staying there late every night, so he and I would talk, and I entered the MIT business plan contest, and he was an IBM, he had worked for IBM in sales, and they paid for him to go back to business school, to the Sloan School, for a 1-year MBA program, like accelerated MBA, for people who've been out in the world. And he came back, and he got his MBA, and he learned a lot, and he kind of caught the entrepreneurial bug, and he decided not to go back to IBM. So he was starting his own company in this incubator space, but his partners weren't working as hard as he was. And I was in this 10K contest, and I needed some business help, so I started talking to him, and eventually, so he helped me with my business plan. We won the business plan contest, which was $10,000, which helped a lot. And then his name was Bill Aulette, and he joined my company, and he became the president. And that was helpful. We had somebody who understood not just business, but people, like hiring people and how to manage people, which is something that I had really no clue about. Plus, I'm 45 now, and I look kind of young. I know that. When I was 22, I looked 12. And I needed somebody with some gray hair to tell people what to do, because when I tell them what to do, it's like, you look like Doogie Howser. We're not. So anyways, he joined the company, and that's when I felt like we had enough expertise to go out and raise venture capital. And we raised, like I said, when you get to that part, let me know, and I'll tell you about that. But real quick story, we raised $2 million the first time on a $7 million pre-money valuation, which means they get 2/9 of the company. The numerator is 2, the denominator is 7 plus 2. So they get 2/9 of the company, 22.2%. So that's how much of the company I gave up for $2 million the first time. So they were investing $2 million in this company, and they wanted to get key man insurance. So I didn't know what key man insurance was, but my wife and I, we didn't have life insurance. Nobody depended on us, so they didn't care if we died. We didn't have any kids, and so they wanted key man insurance. Then they wanted a $2 million life insurance policy on me in case I died, because they were worried their investment would go away. Now, at some point after we spent the money, I realized I was worth more dead than alive, because we had already spent $1 million of their money. But anyways, so they wanted to get a life insurance policy on me, but they had to make sure I didn't have cancer or AIDS, and they wanted, I guess, to know how much I drank and did I have any drugs in my system. So they sent a nurse to the office. I didn't have time to go to the doctor. And so they sent a nurse to our office, and she drew blood from me. And I'm sitting there looking at the tourniquet and the vial filling up with my blood, and I said, "My God, you really are blood-sucking venture capitalists." So that's, whatever you hear about them, that's true. Okay, even though they get 2/9 of the company, they typically get preferred stock. Why do they call it preferred stock? Does anybody know why it's called preferred stock?
Preferred dividends first over common shares.
Preferred dividends, I presume.
Voting rights, ownership rights, laws and stuff.
The main, and I think all those apply, because they do have a different set of board members. And if we'd ever made a dividend, they probably would. I didn't read that far into the paperwork. But the preferred thing that made the biggest difference was liquidation preference. And which means if they said the company was, if they invested in a company and they put 2/9 of the money in, the company had to sell for at least $2 million. Like if we turned around and sold the company for $3 million after they put $2 million in, they would get $2 million and I would get $1 million, even though they only own 22% of the company. Because they get their money back out. And then they can apply a multiplier to the liquidation preference. So maybe they've got a 2x multiplier in their liquidation preference. So if in that case, I would have had to sell the company for $4 million before I even got a penny after they put $2 million in. So this is something like to read in the fine print. It's why when you raise money, I would suggest if you start a company and you raise money, see if you can find an investor who doesn't want to create a second class of stock, because it presents sort of divergent goals toward the end. So we raised $2 million. We wrote a real business plan. We hired some programmers. We wrote some software. We found out that the real application was computer-aided design and sculpting, not medical simulation. Although we licensed our technology to people for that, we went straight after computer-aided design. So then we raised $7 million on a $14 million pre-money valuation. So they got a third of the company then, but they sort of dilute themselves a little bit from the beginning. So they were still under 50% ownership, still controlled the board. And they put $7 million. We hired a bunch of programmers. We wrote a CAD software program where you could sculpt and then print it on a 3D printer. This was 20 years ago when there weren't a whole lot of 3D printers. By the way, to tell you the end of the story, a 3D printer company owns my company now. They were the ones that eventually bought it because they go together so well. So then the third time we raised $23 million of venture capital. So altogether we raised $32 million. And we used an investment banker to help us do it that next time. And that's when I took some money off the table because I went below 50% ownership. I was like, okay, we're in different territory. It's not necessarily about the ownership, it's also about who controls the board. And they got a majority of board seats. So that's when I took some money off the table in case things didn't really go the way I wanted. And so that's the company story. Long story short, I decided at some point to take a sabbatical from the company. I came back to Kentucky because my wife and I always wanted to live in Kentucky. And we had some money in the bank. And we bought the farm she grew up on. We stayed to ourselves. We didn't bother anybody. We just wanted to, we built a house that's off the grid. It runs off solar panels. And built some ponds, raising some cattle, having some kids. It was the good life. And then I read in the newspaper that they wanted to zone my farm, which would say that I could only do certain things with the farm unless I went to the town hall, literally, and asked them permission. And I thought that was not real cool because I bought the farm so I could do whatever I wanted there. And a lot of other people in the county felt the same way. And then they also decided to raise our taxes for something I didn't agree with. So I wrote a letter to the editor, and this is the banana peel I slipped on that got me from the blissful life off the grid, with kids and cattle, into politics. I wrote a letter to the editor, and by the way, I'd probably written like 3 or 4 letters to the editor before that, but I just threw them away. I'm like, nobody wants to read this garbage. And besides, it'll just piss off my neighbors. But this letter, I was mad enough that I went to the county judge executive, whose job I eventually took. He might have changed his answer if he had a crystal ball that day. And I said, look, Mr. Judge, this tax is not fair. I suggest you reconsider. And he said, it's basically a done deal. We're going to vote on it next meeting. I said, okay, well, I should warn you, I'm about to submit a letter to the editor. And, he didn't care. So I went and I submitted the letter to the editor, and it did. It pissed off a lot of people. But not at me. They got mad at him, and 150 people showed up at a town hall meeting. And there was nothing called the Tea Party in 2006 or 2007 when I wrote this letter. So they just affectionately called it Thomas's Angry Mob. And we stopped the tax from happening that day. But I learned a lot about government. I'd never been to one of these meetings. And I was like, wow, these guys have no clue what they're doing. And then I went to the zoning meeting and did this, I wrote another letter. And we showed up there and did the same thing. We stopped something we felt was bad from happening, just from being involved. And then did a couple more letters, and people were like, you should run for that guy's job. You do a better job than him. And I said, no, I don't want that job. And finally, in a weak moment, I decided to run for that guy's job. And I won, so I became the county judge executive, which is basically in Kentucky. It's the guy that puts gravel on the roads, and you fill in the potholes, you catch the dogs. It's the I call it the atomic scale of government. It's like the molecular or atomic scale. You can't split the atoms any lower than that. Everybody says, at the federal government, they say, that's a state problem. State says, that's a county problem. Well, once you get the county problem, it is your problem. So, I'd literally have people come in the office. There were no guards. There was nobody to protect me. Nobody made meetings with or appointments with my scheduler. I had no scheduler. They would come in and get their car registration, at the clerk's office, and then they'd get pissed off after they wrote the check, and they'd come and complain to me about the pothole they've been driving through for 4 years. And so that was my job for a while. And then our congressman announced he wasn't running again. And in the county government, I found lots of waste. Tons of waste. I'll just give you some examples. we get all these electric bills. Like you can imagine, the county, how many buildings do they have? How many electric meters would they be paying on? Like tons of them. And I was terrified to actually write the check to pay the electric bill because it was actually like 20 or 30 electric bills. And I had no idea. Like I hadn't read the bills. So what I did is I called the electric company over and I said, I want to take a tour of all the electric meters. You showed me where they are. I'm going to match them to the bill you gave me. And as I walked around, we found meters that were disconnected. We found one meter box that at the 911 center that wasn't hooked up to anything, that we've been paying $60 a month for 5 years for, ever since they bought it from the bank. See, they bought this bank and converted it to a 911 center. Well, the bank had a time and temperature sign, on a pole out there that used electricity. Well, the county just like cut it down with the Sawzall and recycled it, but they forgot to quit paying the electric bill for the time and temperature sign at the bank. But this was like literally when I was a kid riding my bicycle before I could drive, I remember riding past that time and temperature sign. The county, like literally 20 years later, was still paying the bill for that. So not only did I get that undone, I got all the money back from the electric company that the county had paid the electric company. And that was like, I went through and found a lot of stuff like that. So when our Congress, and I went to other counties and told them about it so they could find waste in their counties. I also turned in some fraud to the state auditor, which like made people really want to shoot me. But the treasurer had 600 tons of gravel hauled to her property to build a nice little horse ring. And she had the inmates come and build the fences for her because she could. But anyways, and I had to work with her every day after I turned her into the auditor. So you can imagine those weren't pleasant circumstances. And so I told other counties what was going on, ended up running for Congress and then won, and now I'm in Congress. And I can tell you all sorts of crazy stuff about Congress too, but I think at some point I should stop and just take questions. And so that's a little bit. By the way, when I was in college, a governor came and spoke to us. His name was John Sununu. And is anybody here going to go into law? Okay, my apologies to you. This is like picking on lawyers. But you're not a lawyer yet. So this governor, he was an engineer, and he had been in politics. And he had gone to MIT, so he came back to campus to speak to us, to talk to us about politics. And the one thing I remember him saying is that we need more engineers and doctors and scientists and even accountants. We need more of them in government and fewer lawyers. And he said because lawyers are trained to take a position, like their client's position, and then go look for the facts that support their client's position and ignore all the other facts. Like engineers, doctors, accountants, scientists, they're trained to collect the facts. Don't ignore any of the facts that you know to be facts, and then come up with an answer based on that. And that's more of what we need in government instead of just picking a position and then going and collecting facts that support your position. So I think that stuck in my head, 20 years ago, and then maybe that's why I got in government. But it is a special kind of hell being an engineer in Congress. Because they're very, like, the creatures I serve with, they're, you can talk about facts and logic, and you can win a debate with them, you can win an argument, you can give them all the facts in the world, and they will even concede that you have won the debate and you have the right answer. And then they walk over and vote the other way. Because they're in the people business. They're in the feelings business. Like, how does this bill make me feel? How do my constituents feel about this? How will they feel about me? How will all these other fine, swell people I go out to eat with every night here in Washington, D.C., how are they going to feel about me if I vote against this? So they're more about feelings than facts. And that's the frustrating thing when you're, sort of an engineer that believes in math and science, can produce answers and good results. I'll take some questions about anything. I have told you absolutely nothing about Congress. But if you have any questions about that, yes.
What did you, I don't know if enjoy is the right word, but what did you like doing the most or feel the most fulfilled, building a business or working with Congress?
I'm gonna be honest. The thing that gives me the most joy is building things. Now, some people like building businesses, but for me, that is a little too far away from actually building something. So, like, when I get frustrated in Congress, I come back home and build things on my farm. So I like seeing something tangible at the end of the day. But now, if we're comparing building a business to Congress, so this is a good segue into something, an epiphany I had when I was county judge executive. People said, run it like a business. And I thought, well, that makes sense. You know, I ran a business before. I started a business. We'll run this like a business. And so I did. I went, if it were your business, you would look for waste, right? But you can't run a government like a business. Here are some of the ways in which it's different. When you're in government, everybody has to buy your product, whether they like it or not. The roads are your product, right? You build the roads. If the roads suck, they still have to pay for them, right? They have to use them. They have to pay for them. There's literally no choice. Whereas in business, if you don't like the business you're in, you go, shop at another business. But in government, depending on where you live, you are stuck with those people. Now, at GE, remember the story about GE? They wouldn't pay the bill. Well, in government, you don't have that problem. Who collects the taxes at the county level? The sheriff. You go pay your property. We collect our bills with a gun. Like, literally, if you don't pay your bill, we come take your house. Okay? So, you can complain about the product, but you're going to use the product, and you can complain about the price, but you're going to pay it. So the government, there are things you can learn from business, but there are some things that are definitely different than business. But I'll try to answer your question. I spent 5 minutes and haven't answered it. I like the business better than Congress, but I like fixing things that are broken, and I like big challenges, and I think Congress is a huge challenge. And what's mainly broken in Congress is the process. All these apocryphal tales about you don't have time to read the bill and there's all this crap in it you didn't know about and all these, it's all true. Like, I was hoping it wasn't, but they came to it with like a Mythbusters sort of mentality. Like, is this plausible? Can we confirm it? And unfortunately, most of the stuff is confirmed, like all of the myths that I've heard about in Congress.
Thank you.
Other questions about business? Yes?
If you could give one piece of advice to us as students getting ready to go out into the workforce, what would it be?
Well, the piece of advice I want to give you is already too late, which is pick a major that makes you employable. I think most of you have done that. Even the political science major says she's double majoring, right? So she's got a backup plan. I always get a little bit sad when somebody is, now my political director back here is smiling real big. This is Jennifer. She's a political science major. But anyways, I guess think about what you're going to do with your degree when you get out. I know there's one English major in here who's, yes. And I used to have this certain disdain for English majors as an engineer. I sort of lumped them in there with lawyers and stuff, but it's completely unfair because the thing I value the most right now is so I have 16 staff that work for me in Congress, and I've talked to other congressmen about this, and the talent that is most missing in Congress and all the staff is somebody who can write well. You'd just be shocked at the horrible writing that comes out of congressional staff. And so kudos to the English major, so that I have an English major who helps me write all my op-eds and stuff that I put in the newspaper. So what's a piece of advice? I guess if you're going to get into politics, do it after you've been challenged in the private sector somehow. I know I serve with congressmen who've never done anything in the real world. So here's my life story, right? I started out in the field of virtual reality. Then I got into farming. Then I went back to virtual reality. The only thing that's missing is the heads-up display in Congress. But I mean, even the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, his first job was an intern in Congress. And he's never done anything but Congress. And I think he would be better equipped as a speaker, or we would, I'm not going to say we would be better served by a different speaker, but let me just put this in general. Yeah, I know. That's all right. I've said, look, John Boehner would still be the speaker if I hadn't got elected. I see people want to get into politics and they do it too soon. And then some of them are good at it. And they make it all the way to the top without, I'm not saying vote for Trump, right? But, but people are looking for outsiders, and I think maybe we do need more outsiders, but maybe a different outsider. I would also, a lot of people, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to make sure. I have a question. I'm an economist, and I have a question. Does Congress ever look at, I know they look at spending, but do they ever really project out and see where we're going to go belly up in 20 years with regard to Social Security, and which is fixable, but you have to go to work on it, and Medicare, which, is not as fixable, not as readily fixable. I mean, do people fully understand the gravity of the situation?
I just thought of the good answer to him, and then let me answer that.
Oh, go ahead. Sure. Sorry.
I would say if you're going to go in business or do something risky, so I told you don't get into politics right out of school, but I would say get into business right out of school. Because when you can take more risks when you don't have children, you don't have a house payment, a car payment. I mean, if your first company doesn't work out too well, it's not like you're going to be a pariah in your community. They wear that as a badge of honor in Silicon Valley. They're like, oh yeah, I had 10 companies fail before I did this one. And then, the billionaires will say that, right? It's almost like, well, how many companies did you start that failed? That's like a measure of how good you are somehow. But I would just say, do the risky things first, not drugs, but starting a company. Now, so you asked, does Congress ever project these things out? Do they think about the consequences? I mean, think about this one consequence. We have almost $20 trillion of debt. If interest rates ever return to normal, 5%, that's $1 trillion of interest. Okay. Our roads and bridges, the fund for roads and bridges, I serve on Transportation Committee, is $50 billion. So the interest will be 20 times greater than everything the federal government spends on roads and bridges. Right? Then the military is $500 billion if we're not in a war somewhere, which we seem to always be. But nominally it's $500 billion. Interest will wipe out. The interest will be more than all of what we call discretionary spending put together, which is NASA, roads, Army Corps of Engineers, the military. Everything that's not an entitlement is $1 trillion. So, do they think about it?
I know that, you know that, but yeah, it's
worse than that.
Do people understand this at all? Do they get it?
They don't, they project and they realize we're in trouble, but as long as they can get reelected without addressing the problem, why should they ever address the problem? Because addressing the problem is going to make people mad. The biggest force in D.C. is inertia. which, if you took physics, inertia, objects at rest tend to stay at rest. It's not just about objects that are moving. I'm talking about objects at rest. They tend to stay at rest because you upset the fewest number of people. So the biggest inclination in Congress is to do nothing, and then the things that are on autopilot just keep happening. And then just kicking the can down the road, I know, that's an overused term, but that's what they do. So do they project out? Yeah, we've got the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. They're not very good, actually, as economists. They don't do dynamic scoring. Like, okay, if you do this and this happens, then you're going to get less revenue from that. They don't really think these things all the way out. Maybe we're asking too much of them. But even when they do and they project these things, we're just not dealing with it. That'll be somebody else's problem. And that's my biggest frustration. But the other thing, so they don't look forward, and the consequences don't seem to concern them as much as they do me. If you guys come up and visit me in Congress, by the way, my office is 314. I chose that because it's pi. But if you come to 314 in Congress, the first thing when you open my door is a huge debt clock. And I've taken a habit of when somebody is coming to ask for more money, I try to have the meeting in front of that debt clock and see if any of that just tends to bother them at all, but it typically doesn't. So the other thing they don't do, so they fail to look forward, but they also fail to look back. In business, if you make a mistake and you go to your board members and you say, we had these projections, we thought we'd sell this many and we only sold that many. We need to kill this product line. The board of directors is like, yeah, let's kill that product line. We've got to. In government, if you make a mistake, you sure as hell don't own up to it. And if you got to borrow more money or print more money or tax more money to cover up your mistake, that tends to be what happens. But so they fail to look forward, or when they do look forward, it's like I said, you can convince them, Social Security is going to be insolvent in 9 years, and we need to do something now so it doesn't have to be a bad thing we do 9 years from now. You could convince them of that, but they'll still vote not to change anything. And then they fail to look backwards. So John Boehner's gone, right? Eric Cantor, does anybody know who Eric Cantor was? He was the guy under John Boehner. He was the majority leader. He's gone. He lost to a college professor whose only political experience had been losing a race for state delegate in Virginia. Then he decides to run for Congress. And he beats the second most powerful Republican in Washington, D.C. at the time. Okay, so Eric Cantor's gone. John Boehner's gone. And we're still having meetings that they used to run, right? But we act like they got abducted by aliens or died of a heart attack or a car hit them or lightning struck or something must have happened to them because they're not in this meeting anymore. But nobody in the meeting, it's sort of resolving the fact that what John Boehner and Eric Cantor did caused them to be gone. Or didn't do, caused them to be gone. And so not only are they unable there, it seems, to project forward, they can't look backwards and figure out what happened. So, it's like when Mitt Romney came out and castigated Trump. And to some degree, Paul Ryan and John Boehner did the same thing. Their situational awareness is, it should be better than it is. They're politicians, but it's not. And if they wanted to hurt Trump, they should have endorsed him. Right?
I have a question. I'm an entrepreneur, the bootstrapping issue. That price finding of your first product, if you had a do-over, do you think you could have bootstrapped if you come out with a premium, if you had found a price that made it sustainable?
Yeah. I had those dreams for 5 years. What would I do differently? Because, ultimately, we sold 1,000 of these things at $20,000 a piece, which is $20 million, right? And, you know, I don't have $20 million. I'm not that rich. Because I swung for the fences. I gave up a big portion of my company. We were going for like hundreds of millions, right? We were trying to do an IPO. And so I guess if I had it to do over, I would have figured out a way to bootstrap it, I think, or either bootstrap it or find angel investors that didn't want two categories of stock. But your question was, could you, if you did the pricing over, could you have priced it differently? Yeah, I think I would have. I think I would have sold it for more, right? I wouldn't have sold it for less. Now, ultimately, the reason I took a sabbatical from the company is I had a disagreement with the board. Yeah. What I could foresee was, so we had taken a $32 million, and they had about a 2x liquidation preference, which means the company had to sell for $64 million before I would get a penny out of a private sale. So now you see why I took some money off the table when we got to that point with the liquidation preference and all. But what I realized was there's no way you're getting to 64 million in the market we're in at 20,000, 12,000, 6,000, 100,000. There's nowhere in this market where you're going to create the growth that's going to get you a $64 million market cap. So what I said, and this was in 2003, this is 12 years ago, I said 3D printers are going to be big. Because they were mostly invented in the 90s, and patents last 20 years. So I could see in like 2015, 2013, like I knew the exact patents that were going to expire in 2012 and what kind of printers could be made for real cheap money that were selling for $50,000. And I said, we need to go down market and we need to be prosumer. We need to sell like into the, at that time, Adobe Photoshop and some of these things were prosumer. You know, digital cameras, before everybody had them on their iPhone, the people that were serious about them would spend $1,000. And I said we need to get down there, we need to go mass market, because we'd sold to Nike, Hasbro, Toyota, jewelry companies, you know, we'd sold into those companies, but there's only so many designers in each company. And so I wanted to go down market where you could sort of democratize 3D design. Because 3D design programs are hard as hell to use. Like, you got to think abstractly in Cartesian coordinates. Unless you're sculpting with a 3D interface and you actually feel the object you see on the screen, then it gets real easy. Kids could do it, like grade school kids could do it. So I wanted to go down market. Then eventually, you know, sell something at $300, $200 price point, get it into schools. And in fact, even you know, made trips to China, hired an industrial design firm, figured out how to get to that price point. And when I left the company, we figured out how to make the cheap one, and they still sell it for like $5,000, even though it costs so much less to make. I don't know what it costs them now, but this is so there's still two made. There's one made in USA and one made in China. But they never went down market, and why? This is, I guess, for the business majors and stuff in here. You can see this over and over and over again in history. The company that invents the high-end thing, like the companies that invented the word processors, they're not in business anymore. They would never come out with a word processor that everybody could use. I mean, you can, there's numerous examples, you know, computers, you know, digital equipment, you know. The folks that made the high-end stuff, they're not the ones that end up making the low-end stuff. And there's a reason. It's a different sales model. And when you're making money with a direct sales model, and then you say, okay, we need to go through channels, then the direct sales force feels threatened at that point, and rightly so. You're eating your own, right? But you have to, and most companies can't make that jump. There's a book called Crossing the Chasm about how you get to this point and how it's so hard to make the leap from the early adopters to the mass market. And that's literally where my company, it's why it didn't go public, is we didn't find that spot. I'm not saying we would have gone public if we'd gone down market. We would have had to pull our horns in and spend less money and maybe even have less revenues for a while we waited for the rains to come and the 3D printer market to flourish. But I think we could have made that jump. And now the patents are about to expire on my device, which I invited. Well, some of them have, not some of the later ones, but some of the early ones have. So it's basically going to be a shareware device, and it'll be somebody else can make it. But yeah, if I had it to do over again, I don't think I would have taken the venture capital. I would have tried to bootstrap and maybe raise the price for the early adopters. But ironically, if I didn't have a board of directors, I would have tried to go down market and sold it cheaply and toward the end. Yes.
I've got just two quick questions. So obviously within business, the goal is to try to be more efficient for your consumers who will purchase your product. Could you talk a little bit about how maybe the federal government can be more efficient in what it does, just maybe from your experience? And the second question, and I'm not suggesting you do this, I'm in the 3rd district, I wish we had a congressman like you, but do you ever think about going back to the private sector, or maybe going back to the farms, calling it quits in D.C.?
Well,
Again,
like,
I'm hoping you can do that.
about every hour that thought comes up. It's like, I've started daydreaming even when you mentioned that part. What was your first question? Oh, how can it be more efficient? It is like incredibly inefficient. Let me give you a short example. So in Afghanistan, we've spent $113 billion of non-military money over there reconstructing their country. Stuff we blew up, and we're trying to make it a better place. So we spent $113 billion there. And there's very little to account for all of that. Like, even the hydroelectric dam we built, the Taliban gets 30% of the power. Like, that's the deal we cut so they don't blow it up. And then the buildings we're building for their government over there, they don't even have the money to maintain them. They're not even going to be able to put the first coat of paint on them, if even to keep the lights on in these buildings. And we're spending like $100 million a building on these government buildings we're building for them. And then we got a counter-narcotics effort in Afghanistan. Of that $113 billion, we spent $8 billion on counter-narcotics. They've doubled their poppy production. They make 90% of the world's opium in Afghanistan. And we've spent $8 billion there, and they've doubled their production. So I asked the Inspector General, okay, can you see these poppy fields? He's like, yeah, they're bright orange flowers. There's 500,000 acres. And if you fly from one place to another in Afghanistan, you'll see them. And they said, well, could you spray them with Roundup? He said, well, yeah, that'd kill it. And they said, well, why aren't we doing that? He said, it'd be way too effective. Instead of $8 billion for like probably tens of millions, you could every year just decimate the crop. But it would cause other problems. But so if you're worried about the other problems, why are you even spending $8 billion over there? And then in Congress, it's so frustrating. It's like there's 435 CEOs because there's 435 members of Congress. We all have these little. We each have 16 staff, roughly, give or take a few people, every congressional office. We're all replicating. We're all doing the same thing. Like, we hardly ever pick up the phone and call the other office and say, how'd you do this? Or what answer did you come up with? Because, do you know what? I encourage my staff to do more R&D. Not research and development. Rip off and duplicate. Like, if I ask you to produce this piece of mail, this letter that says this, and we're going to send it to all our constituents, go find out what the guy in Colorado did when he sent out his mail about how he's trying to fix Social Security. Like, don't write a letter from scratch. Go steal one. There's no intellectual property in Congress. Like, there's no patents, trademarks, copyrights. I mean, what we do is on the taxpayer dollar, so everything can be ripped off and duplicated. But that's one thing that just frustrates me in Congress. They're horrible time managers. Like, horrible. I can't even begin to... They'll schedule all the committee hearings at the same time. I'm on 3 committees. I literally have 3 hearings at the same time. Because they all want to have their hearings on the same day at the same time. They could like stagger these so it would be possible to attend every hearing. Or for C-SPAN to broadcast every hearing. But instead of like a committee chairman talking to another committee chairman and say, hey, I'm having my meeting at 9, do you want to have yours at 10? And then Bob can have his at 11. They just all start at 9 and they all, it's just insanity in Congress. But they do the same thing over and over. I say in Congress, they all aspire to be mediocre. Like, that's the level of excellence. But yeah, it's, I don't know. The problem is like somebody's got a little kingdom built up, and if you try to go after that money and use it somewhere else, then the walls, the drawbridges come up and the cannons come out. And that committee keeps the other committee from taking their money. Even the most staunch conservatives, when the doors shut and there's no reporters there, they're like begging for that program for their district, right? Like, so, yes.
Do you see, I hate to keep asking about Congress because you do so many other things, but do you see a lot of like cultural solutions presented about like foreign affairs or anything like that? Because it seems like there's a lot of money spent like on problems in other countries or on problems like domestic as well. Is there a lot of like cultural discussion in like meetings?
Like in what way?
Solutions? So like if you think about like I'm not an anthropologist, I'm a cultural anthropologist, but if you think about like going into, like as far as fixing community goes and like the rebuild, is there ever talk about going in and like, dealing with, I'm not speaking specifically
right.
What we're talking about, but like dealing with the community in a cultural way as opposed to like just building them new buildings and stuff like that, because we have that same problem here.
Well, that is, you got your finger on the problem in Afghanistan. We're trying to export our culture
right, exactly.
in a top-down government. And their political system is 12th century. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe it's working better, I don't know, maybe. But it's, culturally, they're never going to accept the sort of government we're trying to prop up over there. I asked the Inspector General, like, what's the long-term solution? He said, look, after, you can go back 100 years or you can go back 30 years, after the Soviets pull back out, or even before that, cultures have come into Afghanistan. They revert back to a tribal form of government, and those tribes they'll fight like hell for 6 months, and then they just settle down for 10 years. They just they work it out somehow, and we need to sort of. I think in Afghanistan we need to like feather the clutch. I know most of you don't drive a Standard, but that's my problem in Congress. I have a Standard and none of my staff can drive it, pick me up at the airport. But I was trying to use an analogy where you feather the clutch. Stacy, what are you laughing at?
Nothing.
Do you drive a Standard?
I drive a motorcycle.
Oh, okay, you can drive. Anyways, we need to disengage, I think, from Afghanistan and respect their culture and understand that the government we're trying to export is not going to work. I mean, who's going to be paying the taxes to that government? They've got a quarter of the taxes they need to run their government. They need like $8 billion to run their government, and they got like $2 billion in taxes. You think we got a deficit? Three-quarters of what they spend comes from other countries. So I think, we really do. And the more these congressmen, they're more gung ho than the average American. By the way, I'm like one of the few Republicans who is, I'm a non-interventionist. They call me an isolationist, but I think we're in too many countries trying to export too many of our things that other cultures don't value.
So is that, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Part of the question, like, is that openly discussed, do you think, like relatively, or is that something that's avoided?
No, it's heresy.
Right, okay. That's what I was afraid of.
I mean, if you come up with any other solution for the Middle East than what's on Fox News and you're a Republican, like, it is sad. I'm not saying the Democrats have an answer either, but we're making things worse in most of the places we get involved in the Middle East. I'll just leave it at that, I guess. I don't know that I have the answer either. Yeah.
We got time for one more question. I was wondering if we could quickly shift gears back to the business aspect of things. I was wondering if you could go into more detail on the patent process. So, young 20-year-old have a business idea. How do you protect yourself? First filing, and you said you had patent pending when you were over at MIT. Just go a little more.
Yeah, sure. I did want to talk about intellectual property because the big companies have their fingers in Congress, and they're trying to weaken intellectual property. And before I talked about the gorilla and the banana, Microsoft, Apple, Google, those are the gorillas. If you're starting a company in the tech world, you're a banana, right? So you need something. Patents protect the little guy from the big guy, not the other way around. So it shouldn't come to any surprise to you that Congress is trying to weaken patents, or some congressmen, who I say are agents of those big companies, are trying to weaken patents. Let me real quickly give you like intellectual property in 90 seconds. It might take more than 90 seconds, but off the top of my head, I can think of 4 types of intellectual property. So you name one of them, patents. What's another form of intellectual property that you can protect? Copyrights, that's the other. Trademark, that's the third. The next one's tricky. But it's respected in a court of law. That's more of sort of an accounting business term, but guess it could apply. This is, think Colonel Sanders, Coca-Cola.
Brandon?
Their recipes, what are those? Trade secrets, right. So those are 4 types of intellectual property. Now, to tie this back to microeconomics, in the long term, in a market, in the long term, with competition and no barriers to entry, what's the profit margin? 0, that's right. So if you're you need to innovate somehow. You either need to come up with a better way of treating your employees, right? A better business model, or some intellectual property that's defensible. And so I'm a big proponent of intellectual property. It's in the Constitution. It's one of the enumerated powers of Congress to protect for limited periods of time the works of authors and inventors in order to promote progress in the arts and sciences. So right now, copyrights, so how long does a patent last? 20 years roughly. Okay, how long does a copyright last? It basically lasts from anything since Mickey Mouse till
Plus 70 years after.
it's life of the inventor plus 70. Now, when the inventor of Mickey Mouse is gone for 70 or more years, it'll be life of the inventor plus 90. Because Walt Disney and some of those folks have control over Congress. So you got the other thing going on, like the big companies, like that own the copyrights, they want to keep them forever. But that will not promote progress in the arts and sciences, right? It's got to be a limited period of time. You get a monopoly on your idea for 20 years, and then you make money with it. And then the deal is the world owns it. It's free. It's shareware after 20 years. That's the way it should work. It can't be a year, because then you don't have time to even get your marketing and your manufacturing in gear. And it can't be 100 years. because then nobody ever gets to use it. So that's a little theory on patents and copyrights, but real quickly, patents, I say that good ideas are like counterfeit money. They're literally worthless unless you can convince somebody it's worth something. And if I came up with like what I thought was the best idea I've ever had in my life, and it could make billions of dollars, the first thing I would do is see if I could find somebody to give me 1% of the revenue, and they go do the work. Like, that's how worthless the idea is, right? That's how valuable the actual marketing and sales and building the company and managing employees. That's sort of the value ratio. I think some people, when they invent something, they think, oh wow, I should get 50% of everything this thing generates from here on out, right? But it's just part of it. Now, that part is important because the venture capitalists, and really any investor that's looking at a startup company is looking for three things. Do you have the right team? Like, do you have a group of people, of founders or co-founders that can get this job done? How big is the market? Is there, like, maybe you've invented the best thing in the world, but it only applies to 10 people and there's only 10 people that want to buy it. And then, what are the barriers to entry? Like, what barriers, and in the case of a patent, can you set up a barrier to entry? So those are, like, if you came to me and said, I want you to invest in my company, those are the things I would evaluate if it was a startup. And just remember this, patents protect the little guy, not the big guy. The patents are for the guy in the garage or at the university that's starting something and trying to go broker a deal. Now you can file a patent, and then you can, I mean, we could go way down into this. You can file a provisional patent if you don't have a lot of money, but that starts a clock. You've got 1 year before you have to file the actual patent. But and you can go to companies and try to cut deals with them. This is what I would do. I would try to find, if you have an idea, I would try to find a partner who can manufacture and market it. Now, sometimes you get in a situation like I did where there's no big partner that sees the value of what you have, at least to the level you believe it represents. But your first instinct should always be try to license that idea. And to do that, there's sort of a chicken and the egg. If you haven't patented it yet, you could get them to sign non-disclosures. But even that's a little bit risky, so you can file it and have patent pending before you go talk to the big guys. But somebody out there, here's the thing, if there's a market for your idea, somebody out there is already in it, selling to people in that market. And that's the person you want to be a partner with, if you can, instead of competing with them. And the patent lets you negotiate with the gorilla. So I think, I'm a big believer in intellectual property. I think it's important. I think it can be abused like Disney is and some of these companies. But I think as the founders intended it, it's a very important aspect of some startups. It doesn't have to be. Maybe you got a better way of treating your employees, and and maybe that's how you're going to succeed. But I'm a big proponent of coming up with a better mousetrap.
And intellectual property, which is what Bellarmine is all about, intellectual property. So, thank you, brilliant presentation. We got a couple minutes.